Let's make some sponge cake. Sponge cake uses an egg foam method. Make sure that your ingredients are at room temperature so that you can get the proper height that you can and volume out of your egg products. The great thing about sponge cake is that you can put it into a piping bag and make ladyfingers. You can spread it onto a sheet pan and make a Swiss roll. You could do it in a flat version as well. You could actually put it in a cake pan. So there are so many wonderful options for the sponge cake recipe. Make sure that your bowls are very clean, everything is properly sifted. And just to let you know, this is a fatless sponge, so there's no oil and there's no butter. And now we will start whipping the yolks and the sugar. The whites and the second sugar are going to be done a little bit later. So right now I've started off on medium speed and then I increase to high. And you want to make sure that your yolks end up being triple in size, triple in volume. You want them to be pale in color. So as you can see here, they're getting there, but they still need a little more time in the mixer. Please be patient with this step, as it will give you a beautiful result in the end. This is what you want to see right here, full volume. This is what we call ribbon stage. So when you take the whip out and you let it drip into itself, you can see that it kind of leaves a trail for a few seconds. Those yolks are ready. Go ahead and set them aside, put them in a separate bowl, and wash everything properly, dry it, and then you can do your whites. Now we've cleaned our bowl, dried it off along with the whip attachment, and now we're ready to do the egg whites. You want to whip the whites by themselves first. This is at a medium-high speed. You want them to look like cappuccino foam before you start adding your sugar. If you add the sugar and the whites together, then you might not get the volume that you want. So now it's starting to look like cappuccino foam, and I will go ahead and add my sugar slowly. You don't want to just dump it in, so we call this process reining in our sugar, and that way the sugar doesn't deflate the egg whites. So how much do you need to whip these egg whites? I would say to about a medium peak, because if you over whip them, you'll have big chunks of stiff peak meringue, and that will not fold properly or smoothly into your sponge cake batter. Now it's so important to get these egg whites correct. It's so important to get the egg yolks correct because the yolks and the whites are the only leavening in this cake. And so if you mess up a step or something like that, it'll really pay for it in the end. So you see those are medium peak. Now let's go ahead and fold. I have my yolk mixture in a bowl and I have my sifted cake flour on the side. I'm actually going to sift it one more time into the bowl as well. So what I need to do is get my whites ready, and then once my whites are ready to go, I want to take about half of the mixture and start to fold that in carefully. This first edition of our egg white mixture is what we call the sacrifice, because you're going to end up whipping it just a little bit more than you would, and so you see here that I'm actually using the whisk to whisk it ever so slightly. Now, I'm not going to do that with the other edition, so just remember that the first bit that you add is called the sacrifice, and that's okay. And you'll also notice that I'm not using a rubber spatula to fold in my egg whites. And that's because I want to make sure the air is staying in there. I'm not knocking it out in any way. And I find that using a balloon whisk for that really helps to keep it nice and light. I will end up switching at the end to a rubber spatula, but I don't want to do that in the beginning. See how beautiful and light the batter is. Now let's add our cake flour. So we're going to utilize the sifter once again, or the tummy, or whatever you want to call it, and we're going to make sure that it is really beautifully light. So actually this has been now sifted 2 times, ensuring that number one, you don't have lumps, and number two, that it is just really, really light texture. How do you know when to stop folding? Well, you won't see any more flour, that's for sure. You don't want to see big pockets of flour because once those bake in the oven, they will just stay dry. And so you want to be careful to very carefully kind of look around your batter and see if you have any big pockets of dry flour. And if you do, very, very gently just fold those out. So as I mentioned before, this batter can go into a lot of different types of shapes and sizes. So at this point, you could actually put it into a piping bag and make ladyfingers. You could put it into a round cake pan. But for today, we're going to utilize the half sheet pan because we're going to end up making a Swiss roll with this. So I'm putting all the batter into a sprayed sheet pan. And I want to make sure you know that I sprayed the sheet pan and then put the parchment paper, and then I did not spray it a second time. So it's important to note that with any type of sponge that is very light and, well, this has a fatless sponge, if you end up spraying your parchment, then you won't get as much lift as you would if you didn't spray the parchments because the sponge has nothing to cling to when it's kind of climbing up the edges of the pan. So I'm just spreading the batter as gently as I can to the edges and just making sure that it's even. I'm using an offset spatula, and I will bake this at a 350-degree oven. And be careful not to over bake this because you really don't need to bake it long at all. When you check it in the oven, it'll look like there's no wet particles on the top. You can even give it a little touch with your finger and it should spring back, but not too much color. Here I have some parchment paper that I sprinkled with a little bit of granulated sugar. This is going to help in the rolling process. So let's make our Swiss roll. I went ahead and inverted the sponge cake onto the prepared parchment, and now we're going to very gently peel off the parchment paper. Now, in order to make sure you have a proper tight Swiss roll swirl, you have to do this when the cake is still hot, which I know it sounds very, very strange to do that. So I'm just as carefully as I can trying to peel off the parchment, and that way I can get this roll started. So in my Swiss roll today, I'm putting some really nice strawberry preserves. You can utilize whatever filling you want. It doesn't have to be this one. It can be another type of jam. It can be peanut butter. It can be chocolate mousse. It can be Nutella. It really is up to you. Pumpkin cream cheese, whatever you want. So I'm utilizing this and I'm spreading it as evenly as possible before I do the roll part. I wanted to point out that a traditional Swiss roll that's going to be sliced and served is typically rolled with the short side first, as you can see here. But because I'm going to utilize this Swiss roll for a different purpose, I'm using it for a Charlotte Royale, I'm going to do the long side, and that way I can get more pieces in the end. So watch my Charlotte Royale video to understand what that means. So when you are rolling, you utilize the parchment as a little bit of a help. And this first little curl is the hardest. So as long as you can kind of get that tucked, then the rest is kind of easy and natural. So you can see here the sugar that I poured onto the parchment is really helping to make sure that this sponge cake is not sticking. And if you didn't have that on there, then you might have a lot of trouble doing this roll. Great, so now I'm done with my roll and I'm just loosening it up on the parchment paper and making sure that it's seam side down. And I'm actually going to cover this and store it in the refrigerator until it's completely cooled, and then I'm ready to do my Charlotte Royale with it tomorrow.